Welcome to Ascension of the Chessmen, diving into the esoteric, occult, spiritual, and conspiratorial aspects of life, focused on solutions to the problems we face in our everyday lives. Let us ascend above all differences. Let us be the light in darkness, a breath of fresh air to those who can hardly breathe, and together awaken into greatness. This is Ascension of the Chessmen with your host, Andre Mitty.
Welcome to the Ascension of the Chessmen podcast. I am your host, Andre Mitty. Today's guest is an author, researcher, astrotheology enthusiast, and spiritual seeker. Ladies and gentlemen, hobbits and fairies, give a warm welcome to David Mathisen. Thanks for coming on, brother. Happy to have you.
Thanks, Andre. Appreciate it. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you bet. It's truly an honor, man. And so like my first question for every guest is always, for those who aren't familiar, can you explain what it is that you do and what woke you up to realizing maybe there's more to this life than you originally taught or thought?
Sure. Well, I've told this story a few times, so hopefully it's not a repeat for anyone who's listening, but I was not searching at all for the idea that became the focus of all this work that I've been doing for the past 12 years or so. When I started out, I was believing the Bible literally and being very devoted to just reading scriptures on Sundays. I wouldn't read anything but scriptures on Sundays. But
Wow.
I've always loved the ancient myths. Ever since I was a child, I grew up with books about the ancient myths, and I've always loved the stars. So ever since I was a child, my dad would take me out to look at the stars. I had books about the constellations that were written by H.A. Rey. I've referred to H.A. Rey a lot in the past. His outlines of the constellations are very important. H.A. Rey is a famous author along with his wife, Margaret. He and his wife, Margaret, created the Curious George stories. So the outlines that he proposed in a book that he published in 1952, most people know about Curious George.
Right.
Not too many people. Fewer people, let's say, it's still a bestseller, it's still in print, but fewer people are aware that H.A. Rey wrote this book called The Stars, A New Way to See Them. And he proposes these outlining systems for the constellations, which are extremely important. They clearly line up with the way the ancients looked at the constellations. And I grew up with those books. So since before I could remember, I don't remember not having those books. So I was always very interested in the myths, always very interested in the stars. And it was later that I was getting a present from my parents. They were going on a trip to Machu Picchu, which is, down in South America.
Yeah.
And I got them a book. It was specifically for my mom, a book by Graham Hancock and his wife Santha called Heaven's Mirror, because it has a lot of beautiful, gorgeous pictures of Machu Picchu and kind of ancient mysteries, different mystery sites around the world. And that book, I gave that as a gift, but then I was like, who is this Graham Hancock? Let me look more into his work. And through his research, I learned about a book called Hamlet's Mill. And Hamlet's Mill was written in 1969, and it talks about the connections between myths, ancient myths, and the stars and the planets and the cycles of the heavens, including the cycle of precession and all these amazing systems that are around the world that seem to have a connection. They don't seem to have a connection. There's undoubtedly a connection worldwide, this ancient system that was so ancient, the authors of Hamlet's Mill say it was already, the layers of ages of dust, centuries of dust were already on top of this system by the time the ancient Greeks wandered onto the scene, is is
Wow.
the way they put it. So it was so ancient that the Egyptians, most ancient civilizations that we know of, all the most ancient civilizations we know of, were using this system. So that book got me fascinated at the potential connections between the myths and the stars. But that book didn't really figure out the whole system, or I shouldn't imply that I have figured out the whole system, but that book is full of gaps. It's not, for one thing, they weren't using the outlining system of H.A. Rey. They published it in 1969. Those two authors, they were both professors, big university professors at MIT. They were already pretty advanced in age. I'm convinced they did not know of this outlining system that H.A. Rey had written down in 1952 when they wrote Hamlet's Mill, because some of the diagrams they used show that they didn't. So they didn't put together all the vocabulary, but they saw that there was this ancient language that was around the world, or they didn't understand all of the buildings, but they could see that there were ruins around the world that appeared to be connected. So I got very, very fascinated by that because I was already into the myths, already into the stars. I just wasn't ready to apply that to the Bible.
Right.
When they said, oh, and here's some passages in the Bible that also seem to be based on the stars, I said, well, they can't be right about that, because
Right.
I know that the Bible is literal, true events that really happened. But the
Yep.
more I looked into the system, the more I understood that all the world's ancient myths are connected by this ancient system, including the stories that are preserved in what we call the Bible, including the myths of ancient Greece, including the Norse myths, including the sacred stories from the Americas, from the cultures of the Pacific, the great vast Pacific, the stories about Maui, for example, the myths and traditions from ancient India in the Vedas, very, very ancient, from ancient China, also from Africa, from Australia, from other parts of the Mediterranean, the like
Native Americans.
Asia
Yeah.
Minor, where Native Americans all over all over the Americas, both North and South America and Central America. The Maya stories that were preserved are clearly using this same system. Like, it's undeniable. So
Right. Once
I
you
don't know if
see
that's
it, you can't unsee
does
it.
that answer your question? Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
that's
Like
exactly right. And
that, man, it's so
yeah,
crazy
go
because
ahead.
like I like I said, I was listening to a podcast you did with Lindsay Shorman, and you were talking about, I think it was on that one, you had said something about the Mayan 2012 stuff. And man, I gotta tell you, like back in 2012, when I first started kind of um, seeing how much we had been lied to on so many levels, um, I watched a documentary on cannabis at the time, and that was the first thing that I was like, well, we were definitely lied to about this. And then that just took me down a rabbit hole of all these big industries that, had kept the lying going on for, centuries and all this stuff. And it just kind of put me in a lot of fear of like, oh, the end of the world's coming, and taking the Bible literally, the book of Revelation, like reading it literally will scare the living shit out of you. So that kind of brought me back to church. I grew up Catholic, and I went to this Pentecostal church, and so I like really loved the energy and everything. And then I kind of had a life-changing experience with some LSD that kind of made me realize I was seeking outside of myself to find God in a church, rather than, that direct connection, and looking within myself to find that, divine source I was looking for. And, it changed everything. And then, years later, getting into astrotheology and, seeing how this is in every culture, not just the Bible. But yeah, I totally know what you mean. Like taking it literally, and like, wanting to keep a hold of that with all you got, and like not being able to let go of that belief system, man. I totally resonate with that.
Well, yeah, that's a great point, is how your identity can get caught up in something
Yeah.
to where, it really threatens your identity, or it can be perceived as threatening your identity,
Right.
because we develop these defense mechanisms. It's like algorithms in our brain that are like programs that are there. Maybe they were originally written for a positive purpose, but they may be an obsolete program that's running, but they think they have to defend us from, this threat that is threatening our existence. If we were to question something like something that's become really deeply part of us, well, no, I'm my identity is tied up in that. So, I think it's important to be um, gentle when treading on subjects that are very important to people's, identity and sense of who they are. So there are people that find the literal interpretation to be very beautiful and helpful in their lives. And I'm not running around trying to, knock on people's doors and say, hey, you know what you believe? Let me change
Right.
your opinion here. But there's a lot of people who've been deeply hurt by things that come out of literalism. In fact, there,
100%.
I'm not talking about the general people who are believing it are not necessarily the ones who are um, using it to oppress others or as an excuse to do things that oppress other people. But it is used as an excuse to oppress other people. It has been clearly used as a way of causing all kinds of tyranny and exploitation around the world. So, but I do draw a distinction between, people who are, if this is something that threatens you, then don't listen to what I'm
Right.
talking about.
Yeah,
But
just shut it off right
if
now.
you're, yeah, but if you're looking for it, if this is something that you're trying to, and I wasn't looking for it, but I was looking for the connections between the myths and the stars.
Mm,
And the fact is that the Bible can be shown to be based on that exact same system, the exact same system that is underlying the myths of ancient Greece, the exact same system that's underlying the myths of ancient India, and so on around the world, ancient Mesopotamia,
yeah.
all the way around the world. It's the same system. And so I think that's an amazing fact that completely upends our understanding of history, because
100%.
where did that come from? Where did that come from? And so what's most likely to me is that there was a cataclysm, there was some sort of an event that caused a break before the civilizations that we know of,
Right.
before ancient Egypt, before ancient Sumer and Babylon, before the most ancient civilizations we know of, ancient India, ancient China, whatever was going on in the Americas, all around the world, there was some sort of a break. And so the ancients probably didn't even have, they had a memory of what this system was, and they were a lot closer to it than we are, certainly.
Right.
But even they didn't necessarily know how to put all the pieces back together again. And so, these religions that we are talking about today, they're based on basically people trying to pick up the pieces and putting them together as
Right.
best they can. But it's like Humpty Dumpty. You can't put the
Yeah, it's
pieces
like
of an egg together again after it's broken.
it's like a game of telephone. Like the message gets lost the further you go down the line. And so are you alluding to like a Pangaea or Atlantis type of civilization that existed before the cataclysm?
Well, so nobody really knows, Andre, and
Right.
anyone who tells you that they know is
a fool. Yeah.
well, they're speaking from, best guesses, because
Right.
even the ancients, they would talk about these golden ages or the ages of the gods,
Hmm.
but they were a lot closer to it than we are today. But there was some sort of, most likely explanation to me is that there was a cataclysm of some sort that caused a loss of this ancient. I mean, if you look at, before we got on the call today, you were mentioning a couple of the trips that I've done with the guys from Grimerica
Yeah.
and the guys from the Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
Hmm.
And on one of those trips, Ben from Uncharted X was on that trip too. And I hadn't
Oh, nice.
really dived into his research. I knew about his research, but since then I've watched a few of his videos, or several of his videos, and the ancient technology that he and others are exploring. People like Christopher Dunn. I've been at conferences where I was speaking, and Christopher Dunn was also, a speaker at those conferences. Although I haven't spent any real time with him, but I have read his books. He is showing evidence of precision and what is almost certainly power, not hand tools, in some of the rocks and stones and carved pieces of granite and basalt in ancient Egypt, that even the mistakes show that they couldn't have been made by hand tools. Like someone with
100%.
a hand tool, someone with a
Right.
hand tool wouldn't have gone that far, wouldn't have made the mistake that smoothly, that
Right.
deeply into the rock. They would have, they would have had to really work hard to make that mistake. But someone with a powerful, 30-foot spinning circular saw could make that kind of a cut by mistake and then throw that block out. And we've got those blocks lying around showing, well, what was that?
Right.
The ancient Egyptians, the dynastic Egyptians, did not have those kinds of tools.
Right.
This was something before them. So
Mm.
whatever that civilization was, or culture, let's say, and it was worldwide, because we have blocks in the Americas, and we have pyramids in the Americas that have the same celestial ratios built into them that are in pyramids in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
But it's very likely that these, and there's devastation in some of the blocks in the Americas, like at Pumapunku, where the blocks are tossed around like not even an earthquake. It's like something else threw these gigantic blocks all over the place. There was
Wow.
some kind of disaster, some kind of catastrophe. And there's the Younger Dryas impact theory. One of the trips I went on was with Randall Carlson, explaining all the evidence for an impact, some sort of a extraterrestrial major impact. There's also the work of Robert Schoch, Professor Robert Schoch, who, with John Anthony West, was one of the real pioneers of showing that the age of the Sphinx, all that. But the work of Professor Schoch shows evidence for a solar, coronal mass ejection or a solar outburst. There are solar cycles, and it could have been both happened.
Right.
I don't claim to know exactly what happened, and I don't think anybody knows what civilization was around before all that, or what culture was around before all that. But there's archaeological evidence, there's geological evidence, and now there's mythological evidence that shows there was some kind of an ancient worldwide, world-reaching culture that's now almost completely forgotten. Or is almost, I say almost completely forgotten, because you have these hints, like you mentioned Atlantis. You have these hints in ancient writings that they were aware of this, but even they didn't, know exactly, because I think the cataclysm was so catastrophic that it may be that humans had to live underground in caves or something for maybe centuries. And then finally, the earth might have been radioactive or something after a mass ejection. And then when people came back out and started rebuilding, boom, you have these cultures like ancient Egypt or ancient Sumer popping up literally out of nowhere.
Yeah.
With this knowledge, and their myths are already showing this system in the most ancient writings that they have. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's a really
Right.
important question. Did that get to the did that get to the question? Did
Yeah,
that
man.
get to the answer?
Yeah, I definitely think, just like growing up in school and stuff, like we're taught like history, like, oh, this is how it happened, and there's no question that it didn't happen this way, and like, just like Graham Hancock's work, and like, how much trouble he got into with archaeologists that were like, oh no, like you can't go against like the way we've, thought it's been for all these years. Like why is it such a danger to like question how like the dates and like how old these structures are supposedly? Like it just it's ridiculous how these things can be questioned. Like it should be endless questioning till we know for sure that it is how old we say it is. It's like, there's so much mystery to these ancient cultures, structures, like everything, like so much mystery there, man. And you know all the ancient technology they must have had, or like just way of harnessing energy, like just ancient ways of treating people medicinally, like so many things like we have no idea. And I feel like we're slowly getting back to like these ancient ways that maybe this is the age of rediscovering those, and age of enlightenment, or the golden age that they've been talking about.
Well, I mean, you put your finger on a really important question. Why is it so threatening to explore the possibility that the conventional narrative is wrong? Because like you said, you get taught the conventional narrative in school. Oh, early humans, this
Mm-hmm.
is early humans. And then there's the hunter gatherers. And then as if, like you said, there's no question, this is all completely settled, we've got it completely figured out. The only thing that I'm sure of about that narrative is that narrative cannot possibly be correct. There
Right.
is no that it not only, not only can you not question it as if it's got to be right, the
Right.
fact is it cannot possibly be right. It
Not at
cannot
all.
possibly be correct. The
Yeah.
timeline that is taught in all the textbooks cannot possibly be right. The Like I said, those stones that you find in Egypt alone, and the precision that Christopher Dunn shows on some of the statuary, the very hard statues that have perfectly symmetrical. It was not done by hand chisels and rocks, and
Right.
yet you go to museums. I was just in a museum 2 weeks ago, and it's a museum that I love, but of course it's giving out the conventional narrative. I mean, what do you expect from a conventional museum? And it's got a picture of a stone pounder, a granite smooth round pounder, and a copper chisel. And those artifacts were not carved by a smooth granite stone pounder and a copper chisel. I'm not saying that dynastic Egyptians did not use copper chisels. They
Right.
did. But the fact is, there are artifacts that are clearly done by something completely different from that.
Oh yeah.
And it's just undeniable. So the fact that conventional academia will not even entertain that possibility is a huge red flag. It just cannot possibly be that nobody's curious to look into that. So there's tons of archaeological evidence that shows that the conventional narrative cannot possibly be correct. It is completely in need of revision, like radical revision down to the roots. And the archaeological evidence shows it, and then the mythological evidence shows it. Like I said, if the stories from ancient Egypt can be shown to be based on the same system as the stories from ancient India, as the stories from ancient Sumer, as the stories from the Americas, as the stories from the Pacific cultures, as the stories from the Norse, as the stories in the Bible, then there's no way that the conventional narrative can explain that. It just blows up the conventional narrative. So,
100%.
and and the evidence is overwhelming. Like, I've written, books that total over 5,000 pages with illustrations that show beyond the shadow of a doubt that this system is in operation worldwide. It's in operation worldwide. And we can talk, more about that evidence if you want.
Oh yeah, like was it Napoleon says history is written by the victors, and I mean the word history, it's like his story. It's like it's one guy's story that said, all right, this is what we're going with, and you all are gonna get on board with it. Otherwise, see your way out.
Well,
It's crazy.
and it is remarkable that, things like plate tectonics were just, completely scoffed at in 1906 when Alfred Wegener was proposing his tectonic theory. And then, by the 1970s, it was starting to become accepted enough to be taught in schools. Well, how many times does that have to happen before people start having an open mind and saying, well, we shouldn't completely scoff at what we should say is, well, let's take a look at the evidence.
Oh yeah.
The evidence is just overwhelming. It's just overwhelming that the conventional narrative is gravely flawed. But as you have alluded to, and I've listened to some of your previous episodes and kind of your story, there are interests that are invested in pushing various narratives. And as you just
100%.
alluded to with the, the quotation, whether it comes from Napoleon or somebody else, that, history is a weapon. History is controlled. History is useful for causing people to think and do things a certain way. So
100%.
the fact that, this is being manipulated, or there's no doubt that evidence has been suppressed about the origins of even the ancient myths. There are people who are talking about this all the way back to Plato. Plato makes hints about it. There's a philosopher named Macrobius who talks about the myths being based on the stars. There are ancient church fathers, or some of them were later branded as heretics, but they were thought of quite highly back in, the ancient times, like Origen. There's a early church figure named Origen, just like our word for origin, but spelled Gen. So Origen, Gen being the word for like Genesis or genetics.
Right.
It means, generated by or born of. Origin is a version of the name Horus, the god Horus of Egypt. So his very name means a descendant of Horus, but he would say things and write things about the stories in the Bible being metaphorical, allegorical, and not literal. And then later he was basically branded a heretic for that. But what I'm saying is that the evidence that the stories in the Bible are based on the stars is not original to me. There was a pastor in England named Robert Taylor in the late 1700s, early 1800s, who basically published lecture after lecture, or you could say sermon after sermon, showing the connection between the biblical figures, biblical characters, and the constellations. And you can read all his stuff online. I've got links to it on my website for free. It's Beautiful. All there. He was writing about it and talking about it in the 1830s. Really, he was giving these sermons, and then those sermons were transcribed and written down. But that was all well known, or at least somebody was understanding it to a very high degree in the 1830s. And 100%. Yet even still today, it's not, it's still a shocking idea when I say, Moses is a constellation.
Right.
Jesus is a constellation.
Yeah. It's like, whoa.
It's beyond doubt.
100%, man. And like,
it's beyond doubt.
For me, man, I think, there's been groups out there underground who have always understood this stuff, I feel like. And, whether it was just they were like, these people, I think it was like used as like a control mechanism, because it's like, if we can, it's like you used to have to pay for your sins to be forgiven to the Vatican or whatever. It's like it was all method of control, because they knew the truth, which was, this is based on the stars and the constellations. And, you know, it was almost like they kept it from the people on purpose, as if like they weren't worthy to receive it, or I don't know, man, but I have to think like many people knew this stuff for centuries, and there was masses of people that were kept unaware of it and still are to this day. It's crazy.
Well, so the stories that are collected in the Bible are closely related to the stories of ancient Egypt, and many people have seen that. They're also closely related to the stories of ancient Greece,
Right.
the Odyssey. I
Yeah.
love the Odyssey. The Odyssey is one of my favorite ancient works. The Odyssey, Odysseus's voyage to try and get back home, has just tremendous parallels to the stories of the gospel or the gospel cycle. And yet
Right.
nobody denies that the Odyssey was hundreds and hundreds, many centuries earlier,
Hmm.
probably around 800 or 700 BC. And yet the Odyssey starts with a bird, a divine goddess coming down in the form of a bird and telling Odysseus he needs to basically jump into the ocean, which is like a baptism.
Mm.
There's a foot washing scene towards the end, a very famous foot washing scene. It's like a climactic foot washing scene in the Odyssey, just like
Right.
there's foot washing, of course, in the gospel stories. There's a stone that gets rolled away. There's all kinds of, there's a trip down to the underworld and back. There's parallel after parallel after parallel.
Right.
And I don't believe that the stories of ancient Greece, the myths of ancient Greece, or the myths of ancient Egypt, or the myths of ancient India were created to control people. So this is, I'm not
Right. Right.
putting down what you just said, but so those myths are actually uplifting,
Right. Right.
empowering, yeah, and enlightening, and they can be uplifting whether you take them literally or not.
Right.
So you can take the Odyssey literally and insist, no, I know Odysseus must have been here when he met the Cyclops. It must have been right here. Well, I don't think you need to believe that Odysseus is literal. But if
Right.
you want to me, that doesn't diminish the power and the beauty of the message. If you want to trace out his journey and try and really, it's in the stars, just like the Bible is also, all the things that are happening are in the
Right.
stars. So it doesn't really work out that well on the terrestrial ground. It's actually celestial. There are stories in the Bible that show it doesn't work terrestrially, it does work celestially. But those stories are uplifting, and you can take them literally, as I was doing for many years, as it sounds like you have during times of, um, you know,
100%.
your whole world turning upside down, looking for answers. Yeah, looking for answers. And there is truth and beauty in those stories. What I would say is that understanding that they're not literal, for some people, that is very threatening. But the more evidence, and it was threatening to me at first when I started to see that evidence too. Like I said, I pushed that part off
Right.
when I was seeing the evidence that the Greek myths or the, you know, I wasn't ready to look at that in the Bible, but the evidence is so overwhelming that you either have to close your eyes to it or say, well, maybe this is not what I thought it was.
Hmm.
And as it turns out, I am convinced that it's no less, there's no less truth and beauty understanding it as celestial metaphor. In fact, I think the only parts that you lose are the parts of the bad parts where people say, my book is right and everyone else is wrong. So I need to
Right.
go to Taiwan and convince people there that everything that they've been learning is lies. That's a problem. That's
Yeah.
that's a major error. To go over
100%.
to another culture where a traditional ancient teaching has been passed down from grandparents to, their children to their children to their children, and to barge in and say, hey, everything that you're being taught is taught to you by demons and evil, and you need to come aboard because mine's the only one that's true. Well, guess what? They're all based on the same system. I can show you that they're based on the same system.
100%.
So the only thing that you lose when you understand that it's not literal is the abuses of it, frankly.
Right. The illusions.
So
Yeah.
anyway, but all that being kind of a reaction to what you're saying of, well, people seem to be continuing to teach this as a control mechanism. And there certainly is some of that, but I think there's plenty of people who take it literally. Are you still able to hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
People who are taking it literally for good and sincere reasons, because
Right.
these stories are full of powerful truths that have to do with our condition that we are going, and they actually describe very well what we need in this life. And it has to do with getting back in touch with your own self. Now, you were saying at the beginning kind of about, I had to look for God inside of me. Now, I'm not saying that God, the creator, is inside everybody. I actually disagree. I disagree with
it comes
the
off
extent
wrong
to which some people say that. I think
Right.
getting in, well, it can be
misinterpreted.
there's some there's some nuances. It could be like, well, there are some maybe abuses that can come out of misunderstanding it, but getting in touch with yourself is how you get in touch with, is how you reconnect with other people.
Yes.
And with nature and with the divine. If you're going to get back in touch with divine, the invisible realm, that pathway to that is through reconnecting with self.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that self is God. I'm saying that self is the doorway, or
Right.
that's the part of God that's in you that allows you to reconnect with everything else.
Yeah, like just seeing
That's
that
one way of maybe putting it.
That part of God in you, or that you're a child of God, and that everyone you interact with is a child of God, and treating them as such, not treating them with disrespect. If you didn't want to treat yourself with disrespect, don't do that to someone else. Just like applying the same way you'd want to treat yourself in the best way, like treat others the same, which is what Jesus preached. And I didn't mean to say it like, it was used to like control in a sense. I mean, like, let me reword that. Because no, I totally agree with you. And it's like, I think you almost had to come to that understanding yourself. And maybe there were groups of people underground that also had these understandings, and they would have like private Bible studies through that interpretation. But the churchgoers would go for the literal version, because the pastor or priest at their parish would preach the literal version rather than their own interpretation, like their own private Bible study at home, like reading it for themselves, thinking about it for themselves. Like they let the pastor think for them in that sense of like needing it interpreted for them rather than trying to interpret it themselves. And I learned about astrotheology from other people as well, so I can't say like I didn't have some sort of middleman too to get to that realization, and then reading it for myself and coming to new realizations. Like everyone has teachers. I feel like we're all teachers and students, like interchangeably throughout our lives, like in every conversation, like we play those roles like back and forth. But like something I also wanted to bring up is like how like our culture, and maybe all around the world, and more colonialized countries, like we just love comfort. And like we think comfort is such a good thing, and like whether it's a big screen TV, big house, nice car, whatever it may be, whatever makes you feel comfortable, a soft bed, but we don't realize like in that comfort, we also imprison ourselves by not getting out of that comfort zone. So like, I feel like religion can become that way for people where it like it's their comfort zone and they feel safe there. And once you take that away from them, it like gets them out of their comfort zone, like to this, or their it gets them out of their comfort zone to like this foreign land of like isolation, and it like scares them in a way because it's like it becomes their identity, like you said earlier, and like that can scare people for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not against actually all the industry of creating, whether it's big screen TVs or the radio
Right, right,
waves that we're communicating over right now, and the networks that are necessary to make that happen.
right.
I believe that all these endeavors that men and create are really expressions of creativity and the gifts that each one of us has. Um, and
100%.
so I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to, trying to pursue order and beauty in your surroundings. But you're right, it can also become a crutch. I think I think, you were asking about in some of your questions that I saw just before the interview
Yeah, yeah.
about, like, was Jesus a real, quote unquote, real person, or a literal historical terrestrial figure or not? Or questions
Right.
about the zodiac, which zodiac do you prefer, the Western or the Eastern? I assume you're talking about like the Chinese lunar calendar,
Right,
and the
right.
the lunar zodiac with different animals have different
So
connections
like
to
going
different
by the
years
year
in their
versus the
zodiac, but
month.
also they also have it overlaid on the months. Yeah, well, so all those questions, actually, to me, the response that I would give is, what is all this ancient wisdom that's connected to the stars about? And it's about a lot of different things on many different levels. Okay. Setting aside the question of, was Jesus a historical, literal figure or not? I'll tell you, my answer is not.
Right.
Okay. What was Hercules? Was Hercules a literal historical figure?
No.
Do you need Hercules to have been a literal historical figure for those stories to be important to you? To me, no. Or Heracles is the Greek name, or like I said with Odysseus, the
Mhm.
stories of Odysseus to me are no less meaningful and no less able to be applied to your life and my life and everybody's life, whether Odysseus was a literal figure or not. I don't think he was. Okay. But
100%.
the question is, what is it really about? Yeah, what is it trying to it's true. I'm not saying it's not true. People say, oh wait, you're saying that the story wasn't literal, so that means it's not true? No, it's full of truth. It's
Right.
extremely powerful and important truth, but it's actually about, one of the things that it's about is reconnecting with yourself, reconnecting with who you
Yes.
are. And that's the most important, the most important quest that we're all on. That's what we're trying to figure out and reconnect with. And trauma, you've mentioned trauma. I listened to a couple of your other interviews, is a disconnection from self. And
100%.
the ancient myths may be about many, they may have many, many, many purposes, but for sure, one of their central purposes, or their central purpose, if it's not their central purposes, one of the central purposes is overcoming trauma and reconnecting with self.
Mm.
And that is what these stories are showing. And you just said, I feel like we all have, we can all be a teacher, or we all have many teachers. And there's a psychologist that I like very much, who I've only discovered fairly recently, called, his name is Dr. Richard Schwartz. And he created a system, or he discovered a paradigm that he calls internal family systems. And he talks about these different we all have these multiple actually aspects of who we are. We all basically have multiple personalities.
Right.
And the myths, when I, as I learned these incredible modern cutting-edge psychologists like Dr. Richard Schwartz, like Dr. Gabor Mate, who talks a lot about trauma and recovery of self. When I heard what they were explaining, I'd already been studying, the myths and their connection to the stars for many years, and I'd already been seeing things about, well, this story is about reconnecting with higher self.
Right.
The way that they explain it is, you have a self. Everyone has this indestructible self. It's that is the teacher and the healer that you have already inside of you. It doesn't come from outside. And
Right.
the myths are showing that. They're showing that indestructible self that you have access to, that you don't need me to teach you. You don't need anyone else to teach you. That self actually can teach you, has the capabilities needed to heal those problems. And the myths are pointing towards that, and they're showing that it's actually inside. So taking them literally, by its very nature, externalizes it. Oh, well,
Yeah.
are you saying that Jesus didn't, live 2,000 years ago and walk around in the hills of Galilee with the fishes externally? I'm saying, well, I can show you that the stories in the Gospels are based on the stars. I can show you that the imagery in the book of Revelation are clearly based on constellations. I can show you that the story of Moses crossing the Red Sea is based on the stars. And I've, written thousands of pages with diagrams showing that.
Right.
So what does that mean if it's not literal and historical? It means it's metaphorical. And
Yeah.
it's
Allegorical.
trying to teach you something, but not necessarily, it's not external to you. So if you get hung up on, well, you have to be saved by something external to you, then you're going to miss the message that you have access to that inside. And
Right.
Paul writes like that. Paul says things like, you foolish Galatians, who has, bewitched you into this? Don't you know that Christ Jesus is inside of you?
Yes.
Don't you
100%, brother.
know that his epistles, he never talks about any of the stories, any of the gospel stories? Very, very little of that. He's talking about a very internal access to a divine, indestructible, internal, that's not external to you. And he comes right out and says it.
Right.
This is the secret that has been around for thousands of years, that's been covered up. It's
Right.
not, this is the secret right here. This is what everyone's been looking for, is what I'm telling you. And
Yes.
there was a writer named Gerald Massey in the 1800s who said that's why they were trying to kill him, because he was letting out
Right.
he was
The
taking
truth.
some very, very ancient teachings and
Yes.
explaining it, in ways that weren't really, it wasn't really being taught to everybody.
Right. And, it's like Jesus himself said, like how he spoke in parables and allegory. Like, I don't have the verses in front of me, but, I have them written down in a notebook. Like, he was literally telling us, like, this is the way I'm telling it to you, and it's up to you to get the message. And like you said, man, like, it's not about the messenger, it's more about the message. And, if we get the message internally, rather than get caught up in, was Jesus real or was he not? Did he live in this time period or did he not? Like, is this historically accurate? Like, we get so wrapped up in the historical aspect rather than the more spiritual, deeper meaning within it,
That's right. And the patterns are so clearly repeated around the world.
Yeah.
This is not a surprise. There are entire departments of comparative mythology that show, Dionysus the god of wine. I just recently did a pretty big, long, deep dive with the Brothers of the Serpent into
Mhm.
Dionysus, and we didn't even get through all the material that I prepared, but the
Right.
parallels, Dionysus, the son of Zeus, who's the god of wine, and the parallels to the story of Jesus, the son of the Most High God, who turns water into wine and gets, crucified and comes back. The
Right.
parallels are undeniable and they're overwhelming. And even the imagery that Dionysus is portrayed is very similar. So the there this is a very profound system that was anciently, seen to be connected. Like the ancients knew that Dionysus, they would say, oh well, the Egyptians call him Osiris. They didn't have any problem in the ancient times. They didn't have any problem saying, oh, Dionysus, Osiris, same god, different, completely different storylines, but same pattern. Or Hercules, when the Romans would say, oh well, this is the god, we call Heracles or Hercules the divine god Hercules, because Hercules got turned into a god, or there was a whole cult of worship of Hercules. When they went up into the northern, where Germany is today, they called it Germania. And what the Norse and the Germanic myths, they had their war gods, and the Romans would say, oh well, this is clearly Hercules, that one's clearly Zeus, this one's clearly, Venus. Or they didn't have any problem seeing the connections
Right.
across the different cultures and
100%.
understanding that this is all part of one giant system. And it's the same. It's only it's only this radical literalism to say, oh no, wait a minute, this is the only one that's right and none of the other ones are correct. And all the other ones are a false, teaching that's trying to trick you. No, they're not. They're trying to
Right.
teach you the same thing. But
Right.
anyway, I don't know how
Yeah,
I got
man.
off
It's
onto that
like
tangent a little bit, but the point is, this is a worldwide system.
100%, man. And it's beautiful, man. It's beautiful to see that it's all pointing towards the same thing. Like it's all the same story, just told a little differently. And it's all about where we came from. And it's like um it's like a little kid getting their toy taken, or their parents are like, you got to share your toy. It's like, no, I don't want to share my toy. It's like, just share your toy. Like, it's amazing to share. Like, it's amazing to embrace the same love with everyone. That might embrace the love a little differently, but it's still love. It doesn't take away what it is. And I think
Yeah,
it's
and
slowly changing.
well, those are great. Those are great metaphors that you just used, and a great explanation. And some people may say, "Oh, this is getting too, embrace the world. What does this have to do with me?" But you don't have to believe in an invisible realm to understand that getting in touch with yourself
Right.
that you've become disconnected from is tremendously important to realizing your full potential. All your gifts that
100%.
you were given, you I think just about everyone listening is familiar with, the concept of like self-sabotage or getting in your own
Yeah.
way, or,
Yes.
messing messing yourself up, and then later saying, why did I do that? What was I, why did I keep going on about that? So getting more connected or reconnected to self and letting self take the reins. Some of the ancient myths, particularly from India in the Bhagavad Gita, talk about giving the reins to Krishna. He's the divine charioteer in the Bhagavad Gita, which is in this larger epic that's called the Mahabharata. It's a fantastic epic, the Mahabharata, and it's all celestial, but putting the reins in the hand of the divine self, or the figure that represents that that self that everybody has, the more you can live from that, in that mode where
Yes.
the higher self is actually guiding or steering, that brings all the other talents and gifts that you have, enables you to express them more uh, effectively. But when it's like when the players on the basketball team throw the coach, lock the coach in the basement or lock the coach in the, and then they try and call who's gonna substitute for whom and who's gonna be on the
Right.
floor for the last 2 seconds of the first half, and they're all arguing with each other. That's what happens to us when we lose
Yeah.
that connection with self. Then the other parts of who we are, and Dr. Schwartz talks about this, and IFS, the paradigm, talks about this. I've read, some of his books and listened to a lot of his interviews, and that is what the myths are expressing. It's like we're we're actually we sabotage, we lock our own self down in the dungeon. That's what the stories about Osiris going down into the underworld, or the goddess Inanna going down into the underworld, or it's not always a god, sometimes it's a goddess. Persephone goes down into the underworld. The suppression of yourself is a real thing that everybody, virtually everybody, experiences, unless you somehow come from a very, wonderful upbringing where you never had any suppression of your true self. Then that story is about you, and
100%.
reconnecting with that. And that the good news in all those stories is it's a god or it's a goddess that gets chopped up or cut to pieces or stabbed with a spear or hung up on a hook in the case of Inanna, but they're indestructible. So your self,
Right.
that part of you, no matter what you went through, it's like it's indestructible, no matter what
Yes.
you're going through right now. And that's what those stories are actually teaching. And it's very clear in the myths that that's what they're showing. And you don't have to um, buy into the existence of an invisible realm, although I believe that there's, good evidence that there's something more than what materialist physics
Right.
teaches us. You don't have to buy into that to get the benefit of reconnecting with self.
100%.
Um, if you want to realize your full potential, you probably know already there's times when you feel like you're doing it right, and there's times when you feel like you're just, you know, the different parts of you are battling
Oh
and
yeah.
squabbling and causing, wrecking. The team is not going to reach its full potential if the forward is refusing to pass the ball to anybody and wants to
Right.
try and win the game all by himself or herself.
Yeah, it's like you have this lower nature you're fighting against, and you have this higher nature, that higher self. And it's like, I'm a really big fan of Manly P. Hall. I don't know how familiar you are with his work, but just rising above like that animal nature, to your best self, which is, it's like not about power over other people. It's about power over your lower self. Like, you know, were you better than you were yesterday? Like, um, did you make better decisions today than you made yesterday? Like, just the little steps of growth you make in your daily practices, your daily rituals, like it's all so important. Like, and we get caught up in being on autopilot, chasing the next fix or the next thing just to satisfy us, for a few moments, and then we need something new, like we got to realize, like, when we sit still, like we're actually doing ourselves a favor, and like we're finding that peace and harmony we're seeking just by not doing a thing. And it's like, just not being overrun by that lower part of ourselves that's selfish and all these negative emotions, that can, just ruin our days, and, dealing with those things in a healthier way, responding versus reacting, and, just growing every day, and not getting caught up in just, we are this person forever. Like, no, you can always change. Like, there's always room for improvement. Like, life is beautiful. It's about, how do you see that glass in front of you? Is it half empty or half full? Like, it's the same glass, but there's multiple different ways to see it.
Yeah, no, that's really well said, Andre. And the one thing, and Dr. Schwartz talks about this too, the talking about the lower self or hating the lower self, there's some traditions where it gets kind of, you have to put the lower self to death. I think even the term lower self may be somewhat misleading,
Yeah.
because I think the paradigm that Dr. Schwartz talks about in his internal family systems is so in tune with what the myths are showing, that we have multiple aspects of who we are, multiple
Yeah.
parts of who we are, and they're all gifts. That, everyone has a different mix of gifts and personality traits, but there's more than just one lower, quote unquote, lower self. And actually, we don't want to get rid of any of those. It's like,
Right.
if you got a team of basketball players, you don't want to get rid of any of them.
Right.
One may be really, bad at shooting, but really good at rebounding. And there may be a time when you really want that rebounder in there
For
for
sure.
some reason. I'm just using a basketball team metaphor, but
Just
everyone's
make
got
just
that
make them
team.
just make them
Yeah,
coachable.
right. And so, exactly. So we don't want to, put to death the quote unquote lower self.
Right.
What we want to
We
do
can't kill the
is
ego.
for them to, you can't, you don't want to,
Right.
or the
Exactly.
doubting part, right?
Yeah.
Like the doubt, like I use the metaphor of, sometimes I have doubts after I leave the house. Did I turn off the stove after I cooked those scrambled eggs this morning?
Right.
Well, you better go back and check. That's like, you don't want to get rid of all your doubts.
Right.
If you're not
Exactly.
sure, you might want to check and make sure that doubt part is actually, could save a
Yeah.
big problem.
Legitimate. Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
don't want the doubt part of you to run your life all the
100%.
time. Like when you're trying to shoot the last free throw in the last seconds of the game, you don't want the
Right.
doubt part in control. You want the doubt part to take a seat. And
Yes.
so there's there's a place for all these different sides of who we are, these different faces, these different persons that we have inside of us, but they need to acknowledge, and the more but they're not always going to. But I'm
Right.
not saying that I have reached, the state of, oh, my, Dave always has higher self just running the show. He never loses it.
Right.
One of those parts never takes over and sabotages the whole thing. Absolutely not. But the more, and the myths show us, they are a resource for us. And that's how we live up to it. That's how we bring out the potential of all those different pieces of who we are, those different parts of who we are, those different faces, those different gifts that we've been given. So, and I am convinced that that is a central message of the myths, but they don't tell it to us like as an instruction manual. They show it to us as like a drama. And it's so powerful the way they show it to us. And it's so powerful that some people want to make it real. It's kind of like the Star Trek,
Right.
convention where William Shatner had to say, "Hold on, it's not real."
Or WWE wrestling.
It-
It's like, how
it's
can it
just
not
like,
be
it's
real?
so powerful. We want it, yeah. We want it to be literal. Well, it's not literal, but it's teaching you something. It's so
Yes.
wonderful. It's showing you in a powerful way, but don't get mixed up. It's
Yes.
not literal to where you have to get into a fight with somebody over whether, you know, over whether the Star Trek, character
Right.
had, 6 fingers or 5 fingers or something.
It's like
It's
with the
not literal.
Jesus you're
It's a
defending,
story.
with the Jesus you're defending even want you to do that. It's like, it's like
Right.
people get
That's
so
right.
caught up in the divide and protest and gays and like all the stuff, all the hatred that's spewed through this literal interpretation. Yes, there's endless amounts of love as well, and people get a lot out of it. And I loved my grandma. She went to church every Sunday. Was a great woman. She died many years ago, and I see it, how it's helped people in their lives, and it gives them a sense of spirituality in their lives. And I don't shun people for it, but at the same time, like, can you not judge me because I'm not that? And, come at it from a place of love towards others that might disagree with you or have different belief systems of their own. Like, love everyone where they're at, no matter who they are. And, don't try to change them into what you want them to be so you can love them. Like, just love them,
Yeah, for sure. And the literal interpretation does, like you just mentioned, homosexuality, or literal, the idea that you don't have multiple parts of who you are, that truth that we have multiple parts is suppressed. It
Yeah.
is seen as threatening, and Dr. Schwartz talks about this. There are multiple personality disorders where the different parts get so polarized and so separated that it becomes extremely dysfunctional. But the fact is, we all have multiple personalities, and it's not a disorder. That's the actual state of who
Right.
we are. And so we do have, different sides, and different people have different amounts of those different sides. And the suppression of very, natural parts of who people are is a hallmark of literalism
Yes.
in the past 1700 years, of saying, oh, you can't express that aspect of who you are, or we will have to you know ostracize you, or punish you, or even kill you. So
Yes.
um, literalism is a real problem, as a systemic literalistic um, institutions have wrought some horrendous injustices around the world that are still with us today. But I'm trying to make a distinction, like you said about your grandmother, who found some, very profound truths that were speaking to her in the sacred text of the Bible, and those stories and those rituals. I'm not here saying that that is bad.
Right.
We these I believe that all these stories were given for our benefit and blessing, but they have been twisted, for
Yes.
sure. And so it's a fine line. I try and be very um, I don't know. I try and uh, express the fact that it's a fine line. You have to be respectful in of the dignity of everybody else, and not go like tromping all over what they believe. I think everybody is.
100%.
We're all here looking for this, and actually, what they're looking for is reconnecting with self. And
Yes.
if I've said before, and I'll say it again, if you call your higher self Jesus, and when you're praying,
Right.
or I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think
No.
that's
Yeah.
perfectly, perfectly, perfectly wonderful way of understanding the concept of higher self.
Yes. And
But it's it's not literal. It's
I'm all
it's
about, live and let live, man. And like, you can believe whatever you want to believe. And as long as you're not harming other people, like, more power to you. Like, if that's the route you take to salvation, or, living your best life, like, that's your way of doing it. And I can't judge you for that. It's just when they try to harm others or judge others because they don't agree with them on everything. And this goes into ideologies of every kind, not just religion, politics, um, you know, the health world we live in right now. Like, there's so much division going on. And, that's really why I love having these conversations, man. I'm just trying to, bridge the gap, and build a bridge that, sunk in the water, and, people gave up on. Like, let's find our commonalities. Like, we have so much more in common than we have differences. And, we get so wrapped up in, these little things that we disagree on. It's like, can we just like let that shit go, agree to disagree when needed, and come together? any way possible. Like that's my whole message of the show, man, is just to, get people to, meet people where they're at and embrace them and love them and respect them for who they are, no matter who they choose to
Oh, I
be.
think that's a wonderful message. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful message and vision for your show and what you're doing. And I really wish you the best with that. And I believe that actually the vast majority of people do know when, the difference between right and wrong, or do know when they're being
Yes.
screwed out of, the resources that are the gifts of nature, or you could say the gifts of the gods, or the gift of God to the people. When a mining company in South America goes in and suddenly puts chain link fence around the river where the people are washing their clothes, or, getting their water to cook with, everybody instinctively knows that's wrong.
Yes.
Everybody knows that's wrong. It doesn't
100%.
matter where you were raised. You know that that's wrong. No, this is our river now. We paid for it. We bought it from such and such, and now it's ours, and you can't come here anymore. Everybody knows there's something just fundamentally wrong about that. You don't need any economics lesson or politics lesson to
Right.
revolt against that. And I think the people around the world have fundamental levels of treating other people with dignity and respect. I do think that is uh, that humans are more like that than they are, just dog eat dog, so to speak.
Right.
I think
100%.
it takes actually unnatural ideologies to twist people's brains into thinking, oh yeah, well that's right, taking away that river or taking away that beach, or taking away, or oppressing and enslaving and tyrannizing and exploiting people. To say in your brain that that's good takes some serious twisting, but
Right.
that does go on. People do twist themselves into to do wrong. But I think the vast majority of people know right
Right.
from wrong, and don't have to be taught it, don't have to be. So that's why things like lies on a grand scale, illusion, propaganda is used, because the people who are pushing those inhuman lies and propaganda know that the vast majority is against them. Like, it's just
Right.
human nature is not to deny food to other humans or healthcare to other humans. Is just
100%.
unnatural. It's just unnatural. So I mean, we're wandering off a little bit afield, but those ideologies, and a lot of times they do stem from literalism is used as a false excuse, as a twisted excuse in and not every single, I'm not saying that your grandmother would have ever
Right. Yeah.
subscribed to that. She probably wouldn't. Not everybody who takes the Bible literally would
Yeah.
look at something that's wrong and say, "Oh yeah, that's okay." It can be weaponized, and it has been
Yes.
weaponized, and it is weaponized, and other ideologies are too. So anyway,
It's just
I
a
went off on
shield
a
they
little bit.
use. Yeah. It's like a protective shield they use over there, them knowing inherently it is wrong, like deep within themselves. And, maybe it's being disconnected from their higher self, or because I feel like at the end of the day, like if we were all connected to our higher self, like it'd be hard not to live in harmony, like I don't know. It's a paradox, man, to even
That's
think of.
absolutely right. No,
Yeah.
that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So trauma, which Dr. Gabor Mate has explained,
Yes. Brilliant stuff.
is disconnection from yourself, is used in order to keep 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 people in that state of affairs where the different players on the team are desperately trying to, in fear, trying to say, no, I'm not coming out of the game, or I'm taking the last shot, and
Right.
disconnecting us from self. Because what you just said is absolutely true. The more that we're connected with self, the more the people in general will say, well, that's clearly not right. We certainly can't have old women walking around the streets of the inner city digging through garbage cans for food. That cannot be right. We know that's not right.
Right.
We know that's not right. Nobody needs to be taught that that's not right. And the more you're connected with self, the more you're able to be compassionate towards others and connected to others and courageous in standing up for what's right. And so this is all connected. This is all
100%.
connected. The suppression of the truth about the ancient myths is connected to the deliberately inflicting of trauma in order to separate people from themselves and in order
100%.
to keep them in a state of division, as opposed, because it's exactly what you said. The more we're connected to self, the more people are going to act the way you were just describing.
Right, man. And, it's like fear is the opposite of love, I believe. And, if we're living in a state of fear, if we're constantly watching the news, whatever it may be, and, it's like fearing another group of people, when it's like to the point we're scared of our neighbors, like we can't even like go outside and talk to our neighbors, like that isolation, just rots people away. And, if you can turn from that fear, and I like the analogy, false evidence appearing real, or the anagram for fear. And it's like, if we can just embrace that and see like, oh, this is just an illusion. Like I am love, like they're love. Like I can embrace these people. I can ask how they're doing today, just, little things, man, like every day, like we can do just to like open up to others and, maybe make their day for all we know, like so important. And, I can't
That's
thank you
right.
enough for coming on, brother. And I wanted to ask, like, so I gotta imagine Joseph Campbell has been a big influence on your work, or not a whole lot?
Well, actually, not, not really. I had a wonderful teacher in high school who taught us Joseph Campbell, and I would say that's probably I haven't really done any serious study of Joseph Campbell since then. So I've got a high school level exposure to Joseph Campbell, but certainly there have been many people through the centuries who have perceived, hey, there's a connection here, or look at the hero with 1,000 faces, or the
Yeah, yeah.
myths seem to be repeating this pattern around the world. What is going on here? What is going on here? There's just the connection, the parallels become so
Undeniable.
precise and,
Yeah.
and they're just undeniable. And then when you start to realize they're connected to the same constellations, for instance, a Zeus type figure with a thunderbolt, you find a Zeus type figure with a thunderbolt in India, that's a rain god, or in Japan, who lives on top of a mountain and has a thunderbolt and has the same characteristics. And Thor, they're jolly, they like a big feast, but they have a quick temper. The parallels, well, they're also based on the same constellation, and I can show that they're based on the same constellation. So it becomes even more undeniable. So people like Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung, sometimes people ask me about Carl Jung, perceived these connections as, and Freud,
Right.
Sigmund Freud talks about conditions or patterns that seem to pop up around the world, and he labels them based on myths or mythical figures. We've all heard of the Oedipus,
Right.
Oedipal, well, that was a myth. Where did he get that? Why did he start calling it Oedipal? Well, because there was a myth of someone named Oedipus, and the king of Thebes in ancient Greece, or his different patterns. He would label them with mythical names because people have perceived this connection around the world, and then they would try and understand it and explain it. And maybe it's psychological. Well, I'm not denying that it is psychological. In fact, I've made some references throughout our conversation that I believe that the discoveries of real cutting edge psychologists, who are right at the forefront to this day, like Dr. Richard Schwartz or Peter Levine or Gabor Mate, they're very cutting edge. All of psychology has not yet come around to the pioneering work that they are. They're doing groundbreaking work. It's
sure.
connected. It's connected. It is shown in the myths. The myths are for sure showing it, and I believe that it comes from most likely a very, very ancient and spiritually attuned culture or cultures that are around the world. I'm not saying that it was all one culture. May have been many cultures around the world working in harmony with each other, but they certainly had a shared system. But there was probably some cataclysm, and then it's like the puzzle got scattered. The pieces got scattered all over the place.
Right.
And
we had to put it back together again.
Yeah, but and different cultures retained different parts, to where the Native American stories of the journey down to the underworld and back retain a lot more details than the Greek story of the Orpheus and Eurydice story. It's a specific story, but it's like there were parts that were preserved by the nations of the Americas that were forgotten by the Greeks. And there are different pieces in different places, and it's like maybe we were all underground for a long time because of this catastrophe, and then as people reemerged, the cultures were now isolated from each other, and they took on even more and more. The myths became harder and harder to see the connections between them, but they're connected beyond a doubt. And they're using this celestial. We didn't really talk too much about the evidence, but people can check it out in some of my videos that I've made and different things that I've written. So they're definitely connected. There's just no doubt. I've said that 10 times. I haven't given all the evidence, but the evidence is overwhelming. You can check it out.
There's plenty out there to discover it for yourself. And, man, as I've said, this has been a great conversation. I know we've been going here for a while, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. I just wanted to say, man, if there's anything you'd like to leave here at the end for the listeners, and if you could just let them know where they can find you.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Andre. I appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure. Well, thanks very much. And what I was trying to say is I always appreciate the opportunity to, maybe somebody who's looking for this information, who might come across it because they listen to your podcast and they've never come across it before. If it's something that helps somebody, I intend it to be a benefit to others. I believe the myths are like a treasure that was given to humanity, like an inheritance, a precious inheritance that we have from our distant ancestors, that it was given to humanity for blessing and uplifting, not for oppressing and tyrannizing. It's a gift. So I'm convinced that it has just a really positive impact on our lives, or it can have a really positive impact on our lives. And so that's what I hope that today's conversation will be for people. If there's something about it that's negative, leave that part aside. And I want it to be helpful to others. And so I hope that it will be. But I don't point people towards me. I point them towards the myths, because if you dive into those myths, and if you kind of go in with the understanding that they are actually pointing you towards reconnection with self, I think the myths are they will point you towards what you are looking for, and that self is the teacher that will act, that you already have it in yourself. You don't have to listen to me. It's there for you right there. So
Beautiful.
yeah, that's what I'd like to finish with today.
Beautiful. And yeah, I can just add your links to your stuff in the description of the episode. So
Yeah,
we'll
right on.
get that in there.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. Star Myths of the World is the name that I kind of have it all under. So the website is starmythworld.com. If you just look for Star Myth World, you'll find it there. The website has links to all kinds of other podcasts I've been on, videos I've made, a blog that's been going since I think 2011. So it's got, like 1,300 or 1,400 now posts in there that you can search. It's all searchable. So there's lots of stuff there.
Beautiful. And any upcoming events you want to plug before we end this?
Yeah. Well, thanks. These trips coordinated by the Grimerica team and Brothers of the Serpent team. We've got some great ones coming up. I think a lot of them are sold out already, but there are some in 2022. Like I said, they're having some in 2021 that I'm not able to go to. This one in September here later this month with Randall Carlson up in the northern and western states of the U.S. I think they're going to Montana. No, this one's going to be Scablands in Washington. There may be some one or two slots maybe left for that one. Check out Grimerica. Contact at the Cabin is the name of the series. Grimerica and the Brothers of the Serpent and Randall Carlson all have info about that. But
beautiful.
Yeah, I think you don't need to spend any money though to go out underneath the stars if possible. If you can get away and go out and look at the stars, it's a really inexpensive, or I would say free or virtually free event that you can have, this very night. Go out and check out the Milky Way.
Oh yeah. And I was just at a music festival this weekend in Minnesota, and no light pollution at all. And I've never seen more stars in my life. Oh, it was so beautiful. But yeah, man.
Breathtaking, isn't it?
Oh, amazing. So yeah, I recommend it to anybody. But I just want to thank everyone for listening out there, and peace and love. Hope you have a great week.
Great, Andre. Thanks. And best wishes to you.